Good afternoon for those of you based in the UK. I know that we've got people from different parts of the world. I'm Johanna Beresford. I'm the CEO of InDiverse Company, and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Fou Brown and Jessica Forbes to have a really important conversation around diversity narratives in the media and inclusive conversations. We set up this event specifically because we know that media has a really immense power in influencing how we view other cultures, communities, people, and issues focused on diversity, such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And it can often form or continue to build upon biases of particular beliefs and opinions of particular demographic groups. And so the responsibility that we feel that media has in terms of really trying to create more inclusive conversations, trying to really support the wider impact that media plays on inclusive narratives and stories, and so that the way in which we're reporting things feel that they're honest and that they're fair, and they're not continuing to build upon already assumed biases. So a little about the speakers that I have joining me, and then I'll pass over to them. So Fou Brown is the Global Account Director at MediaCom and the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion and Belonging at IAA UK. She's an award-winning business director and leads a team of talented individuals to push boundaries of creative thinking within the media and advertising space. She believes in challenging the norms to deliver innovative business solutions for her clients and has extensive experience in strategy planning and trading across all on and offline channels. I'm also joined today by Jessica Forbes, who's a campaign operations executive at Mapp Media. Prior to working there, her experience sits within the media and communications third sector. And whilst advocating for marginalised groups, she has found there are an important conversation surrounding representation that has been gatekept or left unaddressed. Mapp Media is a small media agency that prides itself on diversity and inclusion. So I'm really pleased to be joined by you both. So could I first pass over to you to find out a little bit more about you and why this topic and this conversation is so important to you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really important to me because I'm a few things. I usually like to introduce myself as, with my pronouns, she, her. And I also like to talk about the fact that I'm a migrant. I'm actually a second generation born migrant in New Zealand. So I've always sort of lived between cultures, right? I've sort of grown up away from my Samoan heritage, and I've grown up being different from the norm within New Zealand. I now am a migrant living in the UK, so I have my own story there. Additionally, I'm a woman of color. And so that comes with its own challenges. And for a reasonable amount of time now, I've been a woman in color within a predominantly white industry. And I think our industry is doing a lot better in terms of the gender balance. I think we do a lot better than many other industries, but there is still a lot of challenges that we face. So the reason why I'm leaning into these topics and lending what I call my support to my area of influence is because I don't want to see people going through the same struggles that I did. And whilst other people have different struggles because they have different contexts that they come from, I think the process of trying to understand that and help embed that kind of thinking into companies and organizations is where I can play a role. And so, yes, I'm really, really pleased to be here and alongside Jessica. And I think it's absolutely amazing what I just heard that you've been leaning into. I think that's more of what we need.
No, great. Thank you for that introduction, Phone. I'm really looking forward to the next hour and exploring some of these questions and topics in more detail. Jessica, could I hand over to you, and could you share a little about yourself and why this conversation is so important to you?
Yeah, of course. So, this topic is really important to me. Just kind of as Fou said, I myself am many things. I'm a Black woman of color. I identify as a woman, she, her are my pronouns. And I graduated just a few years ago, so I have quite a strong awareness of the job market and maybe some of the things that other young people are going through when they're trying to break through and finding their career. And it's never been lost on me that as a woman of color, I may be having a different experience than my counterparts when it came to finding myself and finding meaningful work. So it's really important to me to always be an advocate for minority issues and to not shy away from how that can really impact your quality of life and the work that you do. I love opportunities to mentor and speak on the real experience that women and people of colour have in enjoying meaningful work, especially in creative industries such as media, marketing and advertising.
Thank you, Jessica. And some of the points that you made there are really important ones. And when you look at the data and when you look at the progress that has been made, specifically in the media industry, that progress has primarily benefited women that look like me, so white women. And I think we have seen progress in the last 10, 15 years in terms of gender representation. But I think, again, when we look at that, it has primarily benefited women that are white, women that don't have disabilities, women that are heterosexual. So these are really important points that I think we want to kind of unpack as we're having the conversation today. The first question I wanted to ask you both is, what part do you think the media plays in exacerbating or reducing bias of its audiences? And if you've got any stories or examples of where you think either of those things have happened. Jessica, maybe if we could start with you and then Fou.
Yeah, of course. I think the media has a massive part to play. I think very few industries are aware of the power of image and what influence that can have, especially for like commercial gain. I think all of us that work within media are very aware of the power we have to not only influence people's spending decisions, but, maybe how they can go about and treat other people and what biases that they may have. I think that recently we've seen, especially in the past year or so, a lot of media agencies, a lot of organizations, and as well like the media content that is produced and is out there, we've seen it become more mindful to differences between people and to try and address bias. But that may not have really changed in any meaningful way on an executive level. And I think for marginalized groups, this is something that we can always sort of see and tap into. I think maybe Fou might be able to relate. It's quite, sometimes you can see when certain bits of media are performative. And I think with a lot more conversation, like the media industry can move away from performative representation and actually adopt some of the behaviors, the inclusive behaviors which they find, which they're trying to put out in their media content.
Thank you for that, Jessica. And that point that you there around kind of that performative piece, I think is a really important point. And So if you could perhaps expand on that a little, if you've got any examples, but also, you know, what's your view on that question as well?
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And I think in two ways, media is influential. So for a really long time, media, in terms of what people were seeing, what they were consuming, was normalizing things. It normalized what an ideal world looked like. It normalized what an ideal couple looked like. It normalized what people should be, what is considered beautiful, what is considered good, what is considered great. So the influence of the medium of media, I think, is really important. Also, the influence of media industries to change the organization to get more representation is part of the need, but also part of the solution. So I completely agree with everything that Jessica said. I think the challenge that we've got is being able to do it. I hate using the word authentic because I don't think it ever comes across that way, but is to do it in a way that is not just about the bottom line. And the challenge for a lot of the clients that I work with is they are good people in organizations where they are trying to create change. And they were certainly moved by the events of, 2020, all encapsulated. But I think there's a sensitivity that needs to come, from understanding that actually just putting people in your ads is not the solution. Right? Just doing that is not the solution. And consumers are smart. Consumers want to see businesses that are through the line committed to systemic change. And that does start again with getting people into your companies, hearing their voices, and creating pathways for them to be decision makers. So yeah, I mean, if I think about to relate it back to my own story, right? If I think about media, and I was going to share a visual, but I won't. Polynesian people were always seen as the kind of jokey people on TV, not the smart people, just the overweight ones that were either really angry or just telling jokes that weren't very clever either. There's also a perception that my community have too many children and are relying on the government to be able to basically fund this. So the impact for me as a young woman at the time coming into the industry was I literally had people question, one, whether I was born in New Zealand, two, whether I had an education from the country, and three, whether I was capable. And I was all of those things, but it should never get to that point. And it's the narratives that they had seen in media that made them feel like they should just double check whether I was qualified. So I agree that whilst representation is not the only solution, it is a good start to normalize what different types of beauty look like, what different types of couples and success in life stages should look like.
Thank you so much for that. And I wanted to ask a question, if you're happy to share. You said around, the perceptions and some of the questions that you were asked, and essentially the stereotypes that were being put upon you. How did that make you feel, and how did that make you perform in kind of your early career?
Yes, I tell you, it made me angry, first of all, but I've always seen myself for my merits. I knew I was good at the job. I knew I could do things. So I didn't let that dampen my spirit. And I kept trying to, set a pathway, I guess, not only for me, but again, for people of color, to be able to show the industry that actually we're just as capable, if not more capable, because we bring a different lens to the conversation. We are able to think about different communities, not just what we used to call the white collar bubble. So not just the people that live in cities and earn good incomes and drive fancy cars. We were able to kind of think from the perspective of the underprivileged or the underserved. So it did anger me, but I chose to kind of use that as my fuel. And I think today that stuck with me in terms of trying to actively to create pathways for people like me. And when I say people like me, I mean diverse people from diverse backgrounds coming into the industry.
Thank you for that. And my next question is, can either of you give any examples of when media has played a positive role in essentially diverse narratives, either in the past or in present day? And a question that, to build upon that, is can you see a different impact on different generations?
Yes. Jessica, do you want to go?
Yeah, of course. One example which I often speak about is sort of advertising within sort of like lingerie and intimate products. I think as we go on and we see that we're sort of learning that representation does very well for sales. It does very well in regards to influencing like the purchasing intent of marginalized groups. We're seeing brands become less and less afraid to show women, including trans women of all shapes, sizes and creeds in advertising. And that's gone a really long way, I think, in changing that sector of the industry, in that now when it comes to what influencers that we may see used for campaigns, what stars we may see in sort of champion or headline campaigns, it's far more diverse. And from that, we've been able to learn that, women of colour and trans women, they do have a clear idea of how they want to be represented. And if brands are brave enough to trial and error, they will hit on exactly how to communicate to their audience.
Yes, and I think the key thing there, we previously hosted a session that was specifically speaking to transgendered women. And one of the things that they said, which really stuck with me, is no work about us without us. So, it's making sure that they're included in the process. And I honestly do think that, certainly as our organization at MediaCom, we do think about inclusive planning. It's a fundamental now to how we approach things, and particularly within progressive markets where you have the information to be able to find out about these communities. And also, you have a really rich climate, a really rich market for different, owned media from these different groups that you can support. So I think that's an absolutely fantastic point. I will share a visual after, because the thing that came to my mind, which is actually not necessarily a positive, but I think the transition of it is, so if you think about the 1950s and the portrayal of women as being the domesticated housewife and, buying a Lux soap because that's what he likes, or buying a particular washing powder so that you can make your man happy. Then as we've gotten into this new world where you mentioned influencers, where a lot of the creative is now coming from us, right? So we have an opportunity to take the narrative into our own hands. And there's a really fantastic, I just want to make sure I get her name right. There's a really fantastic artist, Lainey Molnar, and I'll share the link. But what she's doing is, within her own area of influence, is she's creating an advancing narrative about women. So she talks about an empowered woman can look like, someone who is wearing a very short and tight two-piece with heels on, going out to the clubs with her Prada bag. It can also look like, a woman who's modestly dressed head to toe. She talks about what different love could look like, same sex or heteronormative relationships. She talks about, cellulite and body diversity and embracing all of those things. So I think, the theme here, or I think where we've become better or progressive, is that we as consumers are not needing to only rely on brands to create the narratives that shape what we think. Right? We can do that ourselves, and brands can and will lean into it. And I've seen it firsthand that there are some very impassioned people within the businesses that I work with that want to see that change. They want to do representation. They want to do it properly and in the right fashion. But it might be a little bit slower than, it might, as you mentioned, it's not an overnight thing, right? You can't just turn it on. It needs to be done carefully and sensitively. And so I think the brands will learn from us, basically. And I like what you said at the start, Jessica, about that it's such a passion for you that you kind of don't mind making people feel a little bit uncomfortable about it because it has to be spoken about. And that's where I think the power from consumers influencing brands does come from. And if we take the 1950s soap commercials as anything to go by, I think we're making really good strides, or starting to. And it's accelerating because of a lot of what happened with BLM, right? And it's a terrible situation, but, I'm really encouraged that we're continuing the dialogue, and that we're using it as a means to create meaningful change.
No, absolutely. And that, using it, as you're saying, as a catalyst for positive change, and that has to be so. And I think the 2 points that really resonated with me there is, one, that point around representation. Representation is important, but representation alone isn't going to drive change, because, and I like the phrase that you use there, inclusive planning, unless they're part of the thinking about whether it's an advert, whatever marketing campaign, whatever media campaign it is. Again, mistakes will still be made, and that's when it doesn't feel authentic. And you see it all the time. You see it when a mistake has been made in a particular media campaign, and a particular, whether it's a film, whether it's some other type of marketing. You can see that, yes, there may be representation, but it's just a tick box exercise. It's still the same group of people that think the same, that have been the people that have made the same decisions. And this comes down to this whole point around, there's a real distinction around when you just add diversity and representation, and whether those voices are the voices that actually are the voices that have influence and are able to make those decisions. And there was something else as well that really resonated with me as you were talking, in terms of how do we, and again, it came back to some of the points that you were making earlier, like, how does that then link to how do we start to change this point around what we normalize? And I'd like, as we're talking of it, like, to come back to that, because that again is the shift that needs to happen. What we're ultimately starting to try to, I think, get media to do, and media can really operate in a really, really good and positive space, is start to change people's beliefs and perception and preconceived stereotypes, so that you're essentially starting to kind of normalize things, but in a different way. And that there's some really interesting psychology around that, and the understanding of human behavior, which marketing and media they understand it, and often it's used in a negative rather than in a positive connotation to get us to consume and buy in a certain way. But that same psychology and understanding of the way human beings behave could be used to start to deconstruct previous stereotypes, I think, and could be potentially really powerful. My next question is, do you think that the media sector is diverse enough now, currently, June 2021, to influence more inclusive narratives and stories? And if you don't, how do you think we can start to see the change that we need to? Fou, do you want to start?
I like letting Jessica go first, because I think she raises some great points that I can just jump on as well.
Oh, thanks. Well, I think, to be perfectly honest and quite candid, I don't think at present the media industry is diverse enough, even though sort of like BAME recruitment and such is at like an all-time high. So we say, as Fou has said many times, like, we are still not seeing people of colour, and even many women for that matter, in C-suite positions. And I recently read that about 1% of all BAME employees within the advertising industry, only 1% are in top executive positions. So if there is a media agency or a company, for example, that just has loads of, bottom tier entry level people of color or women of color who aren't actually doing anything to change the brand and how the brand conducts itself at its core, they're not influencing the partners which the brands work with. They're not influencing where majority of the revenue comes from because they aren't in any positions of influence. Then unfortunately, the people from marginalized groups that are even within companies they're not actually making any changes, any meaningful changes. And for marginalized groups who are in those in that tier of their employment or that tier of their career, it can be quite frustrating. And it definitely means that retention of people from marginalized groups in the media industry can stay quite low. If you feel that you may not progress and you may not progress to a position where you are going to be creating change, it'll become quite attractive, unfortunately, to leave before you're able to, create an impact in your organization or within the industry. So no, to answer your question, I don't think at the moment it's diverse enough. There are many things that companies could do to make it more diverse, but I'm sure we'll touch on that later.
Yeah, and I would say we're not yet where we want to be from a diversity, point of view. And I don't want, whilst I completely agree with everything that Jessica said, I do also want to highlight the start of change, right? And also when you think about representation inside agencies, people who then go on to plan campaigns and, think about investment into think about investment with, diverse media owners, think about who's in the ads. We do need to get more of these people in organizations. And I think some are more marginalized than others, right? When you think about disability, if you think about neurodiversity, you think about those sectors. I mean, I think we're doing better in some areas than others. From what I've come to realize, both in my role at the IAA UK, but also now sitting on a recently formed Global Belonging Council at MediaCom, is that, we're now in a position to try and drive some of the change that we seek. And so there's a lot of training that's kind of happening to understand, biases around the hiring process and to make that more inclusive, which hopefully will, address some of the things that Jessica spoke about. But it is absolutely a journey. We can certainly do better. And I think the key changes for us, I think the first thing is just keep doing things like this, right? Keep banging that drum and keep talking about it, how and why it's important. And my nervousness following, the events of last year was that it was going to just be a flash in the pan and then nobody would talk about it anymore. So, keep going with these sorts of initiatives. And what we should and need to do is encourage our leadership to make change, be on them. And I think you mentioned at the start, the importance of measurement and reporting and fair reporting for marginalized groups. And, there was a whole piece around how the government was going to make it not possible for agencies and companies to report on gender diversity. And it's like, how can we fix something that we don't know about? So, I think it's activism inside your own agencies, get involved, put your hand up for these sorts of things. And if you're in a position like mine, which is I am in a position to hire people, have a bias towards the diverse. If you're not getting any CVs from diverse, we have a process where we remove names and ethnicities and all those sorts of things. But if you're not seeing candidates that are diverse, ask for them. That's what I say. Try to, in your own area of influence, again, change those statistics, because you're as you get through your career, you are in a position to be able to do that more and more.
That's such an important point there, that using your position to, you know, thinking around, you know, what's in your sphere of influence, what's in your sphere of control when you're thinking about, and that point, I say it all the time, it's, you know, so often we accept our long list and our short list straight away, rather than actually saying, no, I'm not going to accept this. We need to look at different places. Where are we going out? Where are we seeking our candidates? And if we're always using the same methods, of course we're always going to get the same types of people that are applying. And I think, you know, what, and also getting deeper into the data as well, getting deeper into understanding, okay, why is it that we're not getting diversity if we're thinking about it in an entry level position? And that could be a really different set of reasons as to why I don't have it at my senior exec level. And often we always assume that the answer is one thing, whereas actually we don't really interrogate the data to understand actually what's the issue, because once we start to understand the issue, we have a greater chance of being able to impact that and to drive change. And there was also something, I think, as well, that you were both kind of pointing towards, that yes, we might not be where we are need to be today, and I would absolutely echo and agree with the points that both of you make. But we've got to also use the whole, you know, point on positive psychology, where we start to see some progress or where we start to see some success, that we shout about that even louder, and that we really build upon that, and we use that as momentum, and we don't shy away from doing that. My next question is kind of all formed around this point on trust, and again, you know, from a, you know, understanding human behavior and psychology. In what ways do you think the media sector can build better trust with the changing audiences and those that rightly so are demanding more honest and fair reporting and representation? If we just look, and there's so many examples in the last 12 or 18 months where you look at, you know, how the media has reported a white woman, how the media has reported a black woman for exactly the same, and how that they're described, the language that they're used. How do you think that? And so I don't, you know, and I know, and there's lots and lots of research that's happened in the last couple of years that show that people don't necessarily trust mainstream media as much as we did 5 or 10 years ago. And whilst there's lots of other media outlets that are coming up, you both mentioned influencers, you know, there's other places that we're going to, but in what ways do you think the media can start to build better trust so that people actually trust what they're reading?
Yeah, it's a hard one. It's a really, really hard one. But I think, you know, everything that you've said around, particularly with regards to, you know, race and ethnicity, the way that is reported, like you say, the same scenario, same context is treated very, very differently. And I'm sure that Jessica will have a more informed point of view on this. One of the things that I wanted to share, which is slightly lighter, but I think it goes to show that even flippant comments made by the press can make a really big difference. And actually, it's Fashion Week last year. I was in the Tube reading an article about what was going on in London Fashion Week. And all of the, you know, this very skinny models, your typical models were in the print by name. The plus size models were referred to as plus size model, plus size model walks for X, plus size model, And you just think about that's a very simple difference in the press, but it's just ridiculous. You know, body diversity, why is a diverse model classed as a category as opposed to a human? I couldn't understand that. I couldn't get my head around it. So I think it's really difficult. It's going to be very difficult for consumers to trust media outlets and additionally brands, right? Because there's not been a lot of faith garnered in the past. And there's a lot of skepticism as well now, that when a brand maybe tries to do something, that it's not seen in the right way, they've not done enough consultation, or they haven't got their, you know, their organization, their house in order. So look, I think it's a very complex answer to it, but certainly humanizing people in the same way, irrespective of what they look like and where they come from, is a start.
Yeah, I would totally agree. It's, you know, respecting the differences between marginalized groups. You had that example about the newspaper that you saw. What I see in the press and the media really does stick with me. There's this one statistic that really always shocks people often, and it's that, you know, in children's books, you are 8 times more likely to have an animal as the main character than a person of color. So I think, I know, and I think it's, you know, from a very, very young age, children of color realize that they aren't the main character, they're not that important, and that then goes on to inform how they continue to see media. So although there's a massive conversation now about a lack of trust in mainstream media, this is something that many young people from marginalized groups are aware of. And, you know, by the time they reach adulthood, it can manifest in issues regarding self-esteem and just a general lack of mistrust of mainstream media. It's obviously going to be very, very hard to rebuild trust between the media and marginalized groups, but it's respecting the differences between marginalized groups and not having that one sort of monolithic, for example, pro-Black, angry Black woman in your company and she's the voice of diversity for you, is to have every kind of person of color from anywhere in the world, to have women as well as trans women, in the same way that you can have every different kind of white man on this executive board.
Jessica, thank you for that, and that point, really kind of powerful one, you know, every different white man on an executive board, and that point, and I see it so often, I'm sure we all do, of, you know, having, you know, one person that is being asked to represent such diverse perspectives and experiences, that data point, and it made me reflect, actually, Jessica, as you said, that data point about there's, you know, the main character being 8 times more likely to be an animal than a person of color. And again, you know, and it's made me really, really think a bit more deeply around, there is so much in the last few years, and there are lots of political, society reasons as to why people have less trust in the media. But I think there's also something, and I'm sure, and I don't know the data, I've not looked at the research, but there's more white voices having less trust. And so now is it more of a conversation? To your point, actually, it's something for many marginalized groups, that this has been an issue that has been there for generations and generations. And again, just that in itself, I think, is an important point that we should be highlighting, we should be talking and having a conversation about. I want to ask you both one final question, and then I can see that we've already had some questions from the audience. I'd like to give the opportunity for us to answer some of those. But my final question is, what changes does the sector need to do to make and to be able to lead more inclusive coverage and conversations? So if, yeah, any ideas, whether that's one or a few, but what changes do you think could be made for us to be, as I said, leading more inclusive conversations?
I think some of that work is starting. It's kind of understanding the problem. right? And there are some really good audits that are going on at the moment, looking at the different ways that diverse peoples are reflected in advertising and in media, if at all. So I think bringing that to everybody's attention is really important, kind of sizing the challenge, but then also understanding how to go about resolving it. So again, some of that same work is sort of talked about, tokenism. And when I think about the stat that you just gave about the children's book, I mean, that's those are your first forays into forming opinions about the world outside of your own, your parents. And, having in many instances, people of color or diverse people, if they are there, it's kind of as a token sidekick. And what we can do is make, I don't want to say, make people that are diverse superheroes, but it's really important to champion what makes them special, and to see more main characters, as you put it, look different. I think that's one of the key starts, and advertising plays a critical role there. And as you say, it's important to kind of do that right, and to come across in a way that is, we're doing it for the good as opposed to our own profits, and that's a tricky balance. I'd say there are a ton of initiatives, more people inside our buildings, and clear pathways, having an advocate for you as an entry level person of color or diverse person, a senior stakeholder supporting you on your way through, because a lot of people that aren't from a minority culture have that. And sometimes they have that because they can go to the pub and, have a few pints with their boss, and maybe you're of a faith that doesn't allow that, or it's just not your thing. So, you shouldn't be disadvantaged for those sorts of things. Also, there's some interesting projects that are happening at the moment, really with the ambition of creating a diverse workforce, both in front of and behind the camera, and to give these people an opportunity to take the big projects, to give their limbs on the different narratives, to be involved in that, and obviously to take that equity and invest it into themselves and their families and their communities. And it's a really big cycle that we kind of need to all be a part of. But yeah, I could kind of go on and on about different initiatives, but I feel pleased at least that we're starting with trying to understand the size of the problem and making it visible to the people that need to see it. And it's an uncomfortable conversation, but to the credit of every white exec that I've been dealing with, they're sitting and they're listening, and they're putting support in behind us. One thing I will say, sorry, Jessica, but one thing I will say that's really important is this is a full-time job on top of our jobs. And I think what companies really need to do is to invest in the resource to get these initiatives up and running, because it's hard. Everybody only has 24 hours in a day. And I think if you're committed, you need to commit with people to ensure that things are executed, rather than ask people to take on something that's so big necessarily on top of what they need to do to drive, the ambitions of the company at large.
Yeah, no, and that it's not just seen as goodwill of people, which I think we've probably all seen some of it, but also it's not something that is just, you can just add it on someone's role. There's a skill. This is, it requires an understanding, and it requires these, to be able to really drive change, you need to be understanding things around how do you create inclusion, how do you create planning that is inclusive, how do you understand the way that you start to drive behavior change, because to the point that you just made there, absolutely, you need people to be feeling uncomfortable. Until people feel uncomfortable, that's kind of the start of the change, but having an understanding. So it's not something that you can just give to someone and expect that they can be able to make this change. It's, we wouldn't give someone a job as a lawyer and just expect them to know how to navigate that as well. And I think that there's something as well in supporting that person, those, people to be successful, but also making sure that we've got people that are qualified and able to be doing these roles as well as and driving this change. Really important. Jessica, what's your thoughts? How can we be driving some positive change?
I mean, there's so many, this could be like a whole other discussion, but I think in especially the advertising industry, I bring up hiring a lot because it does come down to that very often. I also recently found out that 20% of employees in the ad world went to fee-paying schools, compared to just 8% of the rest of the population. I think that's very high, and it's a testament to nepotism and just the kind of continually hiring in one's own image. I think as well in this industry, to be frank, there's a lot of free labor expected at the start of your career. If you cannot afford to go out for drinks and make friends, if you cannot afford to intern for free, it can make it look like you don't want it as much as other people. And if you go on social media and you look at the amount of Black, brown, trans sort of creative agencies, independent agencies that are spurring up, you can see there's absolutely a strong desire and passion for marginalized people to be within this industry. But, if we're taught to be aspirational and we are not seeing ourselves in the C-suite, then it's dead in the water. It's dead before we even try to get an entry-level position in some of these big organizations. I think big agencies, big organizations, as Fou has said, need to lean more into sort of blind hiring, go to job boards where marginalized groups go, where people of color and disabled people go to find work, take part in accreditation courses. Again, that can sometimes seem quite performative, but it does mean something to marginalized groups when they go on your company website and they see, I don't know if they center this in their organization, but I know that they spent time and money on making sure that their employees did this course on implicit bias and such. And it means something to people from these groups when they see that, I can't say whether or not it came from the heart, but time and money was invested in dealing with this issue. And again, it's not just about what the organization produces, it's about who you associate with. Zero tolerance means a lot to marginalized groups. And they know that, they're marginalized not because they're not important, just because they're a little bit less than. If you show that you're willing to, if your organization shows that you're willing to take some losses, be it, financial or just in terms of business partners, if you show that you're willing to take some losses sometimes to change the structures that we see, to bring marginalized people closer to the center of the company narrative and of the branding, it will go a very, very long way in building trust and making positive change. And I always say...
Sorry, no, please finish your point.
And I was just going to say, finally, for smaller organizations, they should take advantage of the fact that they may not have to hire a massive consultancy to come and analyze these things. If there's only 50 employees or something in your company, you can absolutely sit down and have that conversation.
Can I just say that I think you brought up a really good point about, where people come from and their backgrounds. And I think more can be done around understanding the living situations of staff. So we are doing a lot with Brixton Finishing School, for example. And I think that's a, fantastic organization that does help, young people from marginalized communities create a pathway into media and advertising. But I think what is sometimes missing when they get into the organization is sometimes, the living situation, particularly within the last, year or so where we've had to work from home, is not necessarily an environment that's conducive to that, because you've got, siblings in the house. It might be multi-generational, you're working with these sorts of things. And once or twice, a couple of, I had to speak to members of my team about being more compassionate for that situation. It wasn't about performance. It wasn't about that person couldn't do the work. It was about the environment that they were having to work within, because everybody was forced to, made it difficult for them to operate the way that, this person having their own flat and their own space to be able to operate. So I think in addition to getting people through the door, I think understanding what happens when they're not at work physically in the building is just as important, and having a bias for not necessarily what schools they went to, but what talents can they bring, what different point of views can they bring. And one of the key things that we do as well is we change up the types of questions that you ask in the hiring process. So it's not about, grades necessarily, and it's not about schools. It's about, situations where you've had to be brave, or you've had to, become honest about something, or you've had to think on your feet. So I just wanted to raise that point, because I think a lot of people are misunderstood when they come into the office, which means that they're less likely to progress because people have misunderstood something about how they like to work, but also they're struggling to get through the door because sometimes employers are asking the wrong questions.
Yeah, those points are really, really important ones, particularly the questions and the phrasing and how you're asking questions, the language that you're using, as well as actually what questions are you asking in the first place, and actually what questions tell you about whether someone is going to be able to do a job. And I often say, and I tell this story often, but I was hiring for CFO and working with the CEO on an appointment many years ago, and the CEO kept insisting that this person needed to be educated from Oxford or Cambridge. And my point was, why does that will have no relevance to the person's ability to do the job that we're asking? When we look at what we're asking this person to do, that bears no relevance. And again, really challenging, why is it that you're saying you need this? And do you really need this for this particular job? And that's very different to saying, okay, would you have, because sometimes it's throwing back the argument, well, you wouldn't have someone operate on you that hasn't been to medical school. And these two things are different. It's always about really understanding what role I'm looking to hire, and actually what are the things that we know, because we've led that role before, mean that someone's going to be successful in that role. And often it isn't a degree that we thought maybe previously. So kind of really challenging our own thinking, our own beliefs around that's really important. And the things that you were both touching upon there, I think, both, so much of this is around systemic change that needs to be made, whether that's around just, the culture that's been created across the whole industry of the expectations around free paid internships. We the ability to be able to live in London, as an example, and work for free reduces your pool to a really, really small pool straight away. And what you were just saying there as well, in terms of the choices and thinking about, and I think it's a really kind of mature way of thinking about, actually, it's not just about when we're bringing people in, but when we've got people, and every decision, and we often talk about this, every decision a business makes should be premised on thinking around inclusion as much as you think about your finance. So whether that's when you're going through, sadly, as many businesses have, redundancy processes, ensuring that doesn't disproportionately impact marginalized groups, as an example, thinking about, as we are for many businesses at the moment, returning in a safe way post-pandemic, what does the next few months look? How do we ensure that actually we're offering opportunities for those that don't have a working space that allows them to be their most productive, making sure that they are at the top of the queue? These are things that actually don't cost often businesses huge amounts of money, but require you to put inclusion at the same importance you often put finance when you're making a corporate decision, whether that's around your office environment, whether that's around your recruitment, whether that's around your supply chain. whether that's around your supplier and your procurement selection. So I think these, like some of the points that you hear, these are systemic changes that actually, yes, they require time, often not huge investment, but they really require commitment. And what they require is us as people in positions of leadership to be thinking and challenging our thinking, and often to be reflecting on small things that we might need to make changes to the way that we've behaved and the way that we perhaps have operated. I wanted to just go to a couple of the questions that we've been asked. One was from something that you'd mentioned earlier in the conversation, Jessica, and your reference to the lingerie example. And a question for both of you: why do you think certain sectors are moving faster than others?
Okay, I could, Jessica, do you want to go, because it's related specifically to your lingerie piece?
Yeah, of course. I think the sectors that are moving fastest are the ones that are quite, dare I say, bold anyway, quite like bold and daring. Like, for example, lingerie advertising is something that was always going to be racy and a little bit controversial. And, you know, if there's any part of the industry that's going to say, you know, what the hell, it would be that part. And there's more traditional products, more. I think, you know, I think it depends on the product and what kinds of people that we use to sort of like spearhead campaigns. If it's, you know, if it's a kind of product like lingerie that often uses supermodels and celebrities, then it's very easy to pick a celebrity from a closed community to put them as your new figurehead, and, you know, people will follow afterwards. If it's, if, you know, for example, you're marketing something like, I don't know, detergent or something, you want everybody to have this in their household, you realize it's not particularly racy or daring, and you're less likely to go for a non-traditional sort of like figurehead, for example, your advertising campaigns. And I think that's where we can see which industries are like being very brave and bold to go ahead and put inclusivity and diversity at their center, and some which have to be a little bit more reserved on their uptake of these ideas.
And I think it's a really interesting point that you raise about categories that are inherently bold or racy, because I think there are certainly some categories that are a little bit more tied to legislation. So in terms of what they can do, what they can show, what they can say, how quickly they can iterate messaging. And then you have certain categories that are a little bit more, you know, sometimes they just don't play a role, you know. So I think a really good one is kind of, you know, faith in most categories. You have to be really sensitive about how that plays up, and you want to, and maybe you want to speak to people of these communities, but you're quite mindful that in and of itself is like a very, it's a very sensitive territory. So I think you've got brands that are more risk averse, either because in their kind of, because of the category that they sit in, it might be more medical, for example, where you need to be a little bit more factual, scientific, that sort of thing, or there's legislation that prevents them from doing certain things in certain countries. Then you might have brands where their core architecture might also make them a little bit nervous about being bold. You know, so Needscope Orange is all about, you know, safe families, and it's very normative kind of, you know. So I think, to answer your question, sometimes it's about the category, sometimes it's about the brand themselves, and sometimes it's about the business and the business's taste for risk. The positive thing being, though, is that the more that we normalize what different looks like, the less risk they'll feel that they're trying to avoid.
Yes, no, I like that. And that comes back to some of the earlier points that you made right at the start of the conversation around, you know, normalizing and the impact that media has had. very conscious of time, and we're kind of out of time. I just wanted to mention and summarize a couple of the points that particularly resonated from what you've both been saying over the last hour. I think that this point around representation, we know, is so important, but alone isn't going to drive the change that we need. It has to be also around looking at the culture, looking at the behaviours within organisations, within brands, within those that are in positions of influence, along with representation. I think this point, you both mentioned it, on the fact that this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation. For us to see change, people will feel uncomfortable. That this point again that we've touched a couple of times on, how we've normalized things, but how do we shift that on its head so that we can start to deconstruct stereotypes, so we can start to share different lived experiences through media narratives, through the way that we're talking, through the conversations that we're having. And then finally, this point on, for us to make change, and the, some absolutely fantastic suggestions from both of you. So much of this is around systemic changes. So whether that's to a policy, whether that's to a process, whether that's just to a way of working that we've just always accepted and we need to change that. And then the other part is very much around us as individuals and the part that we each play and the sphere of influence we have, the sphere of control we have, but also how we're trying to influence change and behaviours of others and those that are around us. And yes, I agree with both of you. We have a lot of progress to make, but I also agree that I think that there has been changes, and how do we build upon that to start to drive momentum and to drive positive change going forward as well. So I could carry on the conversation. I've really enjoyed it, but I just wanted to take this time to say a massive thank you to both of you for speaking to me today, and I hope everyone in the audience has enjoyed the conversation as much as I have.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.